I'm a 33-year-old woman, and I grew up in a family where I was always the extra piece nobody needed. My parents, wealthy and obsessed with appearances, had 3 kids. My older siblings, let's call them Ethan and Victoria, were the golden children. Ethan was the athletic one, Victoria was the social butterfly, and I was the quiet kid who got good grades but didn't shine in ways they cared about. It wasn't like they outright hated me. It was worse, they acted like I didn't exist. Ethan was showered with praise every time he brought home a trophy, and Victoria's endless shopping sprees were always necessary because she had to keep up with her social circle. Meanwhile, I was told to be practical and make do with whatever hand-me-downs Victoria decided she didn't want anymore. When I was 14, I started realizing how deep the favoritism ran. Ethan crashed his car, a shiny new sports car my parents had gifted him for his 18th birthday, because he was racing his friends. Instead of getting in trouble, my parents replaced it within a week. When I asked for a new laptop for schoolwork, I was told to save up and buy it myself. They weren't made of money, apparently, despite owning multiple properties and hosting lavish parties every month. I thought maybe if I worked hard enough, they'd finally notice me. In high school, I graduated at the top of my class. My parents didn't come to the ceremony because Ethan had a tennis match that day. When I got into an Ivy League college on a scholarship, they didn't even mention it to anyone. Meanwhile, Victoria dropped out of college after a year, saying it wasn't her thing. My parents were so proud of her for finding herself that they funded her boutique business, which failed within 6 months. By the time I was in college, I'd stopped expecting anything from them. I started my own small business, a side hustle tutoring kids in math, which eventually grew into a full-fledged online learning platform. I didn't need their money, but it still stung that they never once acknowledged my accomplishments. They acted like Ethan and Victoria were the family's only successes, even though neither of them could hold down a job without constant help. The breaking point came when I was 28. I had been invited to a family gathering, one of those over-the-top events my parents threw to show off their perfect family. I overheard them talking about me in the kitchen. My dad joked that my career was cute, but that I'd never amount to anything significant because I wasn't bold like Ethan or Victoria. My mom laughed and added that at least they didn't have to worry about me because I could fend for myself. They genuinely believed their neglect was a compliment. I walked out of that gathering early, but not before I noticed something odd. My grandfather, my dad's father, had pulled me aside earlier that day and asked how I was doing. He was the only person in the family who ever seemed to care. He didn't say much, but the way he looked at me that day stuck with me, almost like he was apologizing for something he couldn't fix. A few months later, I found out my name wasn't even included in my parents' will. Ethan and Victoria were listed as beneficiaries of the family trust, but I wasn't. My mom told me, completely unprompted, that it was because I was independent and didn't need anything. It wasn't just hurtful, it was infuriating. Ethan and Victoria had burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars in failed ventures and luxury purchases, yet they were being rewarded for it. Around the same time, my grandfather fell ill. He was the one managing the family trust, and there were whispers about transferring control to my parents. I couldn't imagine a worse idea. Curious, I started looking into the trust and the family's finances. What I found was a mess. Ethan had been using trust funds to finance a series of failed tech startups, and Victoria had drained tens of thousands on designer goods and business trips that were really just vacations. My parents had covered up most of it, likely to protect the family's reputation. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I reached out to an old college friend who specialized in estate law. We talked through some options, and I started to see a path forward. Meanwhile, my grandfather started confiding in me more, saying he regretted how things had turned out with the family. He hinted that he wished the trust could go to someone responsible. The rest of the family didn't even notice we were growing closer. They were too busy fighting over who would get what once my grandfather passed. At one point, Ethan even joked about selling the family estate to cover his debts. They were so sure of their entitlement that they didn't see what was coming. Then my grandfather invited me to a family meeting about the trust. It was the first time I felt like I might actually have a say in the family's future. And I was ready to make sure things would never go back to the way they were. When the family meeting about the trust began, I could already tell it wouldn't be a smooth ride. My grandfather, seated at the head of the long dining table, looked frail but determined. My parents and siblings were all there, acting as if this was just a formality. They were so confident that control of the trust would pass directly to my parents that they barely acknowledged me. But then my grandfather dropped the bombshell. He was amending the trust to add me as a co-trustee. The room went silent for a moment before chaos erupted. My mother's voice was the loudest, demanding to know why. Ethan and Victoria quickly joined in, accusing me of manipulating our grandfather. They were so focused on yelling over each other that they didn't notice I had come prepared. When the accusations started flying, I calmly presented the evidence of their financial irresponsibility, bank statements, receipts, and a detailed breakdown of trust fund mismanagement. The look on their faces was priceless. Ethan tried to deny the failed investments, and Victoria claimed her spending was justified. But the numbers didn't lie. My grandfather didn't say much, but the fact that he stayed silent while I spoke said everything. By the end of the meeting, my grandfather had granted me partial control of the trust effective immediately. This meant I could freeze any unnecessary distributions and approve or deny any new expenses. Naturally, my family was furious. My father tried to regain control by insisting that the family trust was meant to support family unity. I countered by pointing out that unity didn't mean enabling reckless behavior. My siblings had drained resources for years, and my parents had turned a blind eye. If anything, my involvement was a way to preserve what was left of the family wealth. Once I started reviewing the trust's financials in detail, I uncovered even more problems. Ethan had taken out loans using his share of the trust as collateral, racking up debts he couldn't repay. Victoria had made several shady deals with business partners who disappeared after pocketing the money. I froze all discretionary distributions immediately, citing mismanagement. The trust's funds would no longer bankroll designer wardrobes or ill-advised ventures. My siblings were livid. Ethan tried to guilt-trip me by bringing up how we used to play together as kids, but it was a weak attempt. They had decades of bad behavior to answer for, and I wasn't budging. My parents weren't any better. They tried to undermine me by appealing directly to my grandfather, claiming I was being unreasonable. My grandfather, however, was tired of their excuses. He publicly sided with me, stating that it was about time someone responsible stepped in. That didn't stop my siblings from escalating. They threatened to sue me for overstepping, but I had already anticipated this move. My lawyer friend, who specialized in estate law, had made sure everything was legally solid. The siblings' threats fizzled out as quickly as they started. In the midst of all this, I received a surprising message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd been estranged from the family for reasons nobody ever explained, but now she wanted to help. She claimed to have insider information about some of Ethan and Victoria's past schemes. At first, I was skeptical, but when she sent me copies of old emails and financial documents, I knew she was telling the truth. This information was a goldmine, exposing fraudulent activities that my siblings had hidden for years. It was clear that I wasn't just dealing with irresponsibility, I was dealing with outright deception. With this new leverage, I started making changes to how the trust operated. I redirected funds that had been wasted on luxuries to meaningful causes, like scholarships and community projects. Word of these changes spread quickly, and family friends began asking questions. My siblings hated the newfound scrutiny. They were used to being seen as successful heirs, but now people were starting to see them for what they really were. Public embarrassment was the last thing they wanted, but it was exactly what they got. The next family meeting was a showdown. I laid out new rules: no more frivolous spending, no more secretive deals, and no more secretive deals, and no more bailouts. My siblings tried to argue, but my grandfather backed me up. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the old family hierarchy was crumbling. Ethan and Victoria were no longer the favorites. They were now financially dependent on the decisions I made, and they knew it. As I walked out of that meeting, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. For years, I had been the invisible one, the one they overlooked. Now the tables had turned. They needed me, and I wasn't about to let them forget it. This was just the beginning. Not long after I implemented the new rules for the family trust, things started to unravel fast. The first sign of trouble came from Ethan. He'd poured money into yet another doomed tech startup, and it collapsed within months. This time, though, he didn't have the usual safety net. He showed up unannounced, desperate and demanding a bailout. Without the trust funds to cover his losses, he was on the verge of bankruptcy. I didn't refuse outright, but made it clear that any help would come with conditions. He'd have to sign a public statement admitting his financial mismanagement and agreeing to oversight for any future projects. Ethan stormed out, but I knew he'd be back. Meanwhile, my parents were turning on each other. For years, they had enabled Ethan and Victoria's reckless spending, but now they were pointing fingers. My dad blamed my mom for being too lenient with Victoria's business ventures, and she accused him of favoring Ethan's failed investments. Their fight spilled over into family gatherings, making the tension impossible to ignore. It was clear that the cracks in their perfect facade were widening. As my reforms started taking effect, the family's social circle began to shrink. Friends who had once flocked to my parents' parties started distancing themselves. Without the endless flow of luxury vacations and extravagant events funded by the trust, my parents couldn't keep up appearances. It wasn't long before whispers about the family's dysfunction began circulating. During this time, my grandfather called me aside for a private conversation. He admitted he'd made mistakes in how he raised my father, and, by extension, how the family treated me. He confessed that he had allowed things to spiral out of control and wanted to make things right. To my surprise, he offered me even more control over the trust, saying he trusted my judgment more than anyone else in the family. It was a bittersweet moment, but I accepted his offer. I knew I'd need that authority for what was coming next. Ethan's desperation took an ugly turn. When it became clear that I wasn't going to hand over money without accountability, he tried a different tactic. He reached out to my lawyer friend, attempting to bribe her into undermining me. Unfortunately for Ethan, my friend was loyal and informed me immediately. I confronted him with proof of his attempt, and he had no choice but to back down. It was another nail in the coffin of his credibility. Victoria wasn't faring much better. Without access to trust funds, she could no longer maintain her lavish lifestyle. I cut off all luxury expenses, including her monthly allowance for designer shopping. This led to a string of tantrums, but I stood firm. The changes caught the attention of a local news outlet, which ran a story about how I was using the trust to support scholarships and community projects. The article painted me as a hero for standing up to nepotism, while my siblings were cast as entitled heirs squandering their wealth. The public embarrassment hit them hard. Around this time, my family held a secret meeting to discuss how they could remove me from the trust. They underestimated me again. My cousin, who had been feeding me information, tipped me off about their plans. I showed up uninvited, armed with evidence of their previous mismanagement and shady dealings. Their attempt to oust me fell apart on the spot, and I made it clear that any further scheming would only backfire. My cousin's alliance proved invaluable. She uncovered even more evidence of fraud, including documents that implicated Victoria in embezzling funds from one of her failed businesses. This revelation led to serious legal consequences for Victoria, and for once, my parents couldn't protect her. It was a harsh but necessary lesson. Throughout all of this, I made it a point to refuse any personal benefits from the trust. I didn't want anyone accusing me of hypocrisy, and it helped earn the respect of outsiders. Friends who had once been distant began reaching out, praising me for taking a stand. Even distant relatives who had previously sided with my parents started changing their tune. My parents, however, were relentless. They issued an ultimatum: demanding that I relinquish control of the trust to restore family harmony. I countered with a detailed report of their financial misdeeds, making it clear that they were in no position to make demands. The conversation ended with my parents retreating, angrier than ever but unable to argue with the facts. The pressure was too much for Ethan, who had a public meltdown at a social event. He blamed me for his problems, accusing me of ruining his life. It was an embarrassing display, but I refused to engage. The damage he had done to himself was far worse than anything I could have said. The final blow came during another family meeting. My grandfather announced he was rewriting his will, leaving the majority of his estate to me. The room was silent as he explained his decision, emphasizing that it was based on responsibility and trustworthiness. It was a moment that changed everything. My siblings looked devastated, my parents were furious, and I knew the power dynamics in the family would never be the same. As I left the meeting, I hinted that this was only the beginning. The family might not have realized it yet, but the days of their entitlement were over. It wasn't long after my grandfather's announcement about rewriting the will that his health took a turn for the worse. Despite the strained family dynamics, I stayed by his side during his final weeks, ensuring he had everything he needed. My siblings and parents showed up sporadically, mostly to ask for updates on his condition rather than to actually spend time with him. When he passed away, the sadness was mixed with an odd sense of finality. I knew his loss would trigger a storm, and I was ready. The will reading happened a few weeks later, with the entire family in attendance. My parents and siblings were dressed in somber black, their faces a mix of curiosity and poorly concealed anticipation. They were confident that the estate and trust would fall back into their hands, despite my recent involvement. But when the lawyer announced that the majority of the trust and the family estate were now under my sole control, the room erupted. Ethan accused me of manipulating our grandfather during his final days, claiming that I'd taken advantage of his weakened state. Victoria backed him up, calling the decision unfair and a betrayal of family values. Their accusations didn't last long. The lawyer presented signed documents and video recordings of my grandfather clearly outlining his wishes. Every safeguard had been put in place, and there was no room for them to contest it. The backlash didn't stop there. My parents immediately issued an ultimatum, demanding that I split the inheritance evenly to maintain family unity. I responded by calmly reminding them of the years they'd spent neglecting me while bailing out Ethan and Victoria. I also pointed out the evidence of their financial mismanagement that had forced my grandfather's hand in the first place. They had no comeback, but their anger was palpable. At the same meeting, I announced my decision to sell the family estate. That was the final blow. The estate had been the centerpiece of their social identity, the venue for countless lavish parties and a symbol of their supposed success. Losing access to it felt like losing their last shred of prestige. Ethan stormed out, slamming the door behind him, while Victoria sat in stunned silence. My parents didn't say a word, but their expressions said everything. The fallout was swift. Word of the will's contents and the sale of the estate leaked to the local media, and the story quickly went viral. Articles framed the family as entitled heirs who had squandered their wealth and were now paying the price, while I was portrayed as the responsible one stepping in to fix the damage. The embarrassment hit them hard, especially my parents, who had built their reputation around the image of a perfect, successful family. While the media frenzy unfolded, I made good on my promise to use the trust's funds for meaningful causes. I announced a new scholarship program for underprivileged students, funded entirely by the trust. The positive press from this initiative further cemented my position as the responsible heir. My siblings, on the other hand, were struggling to stay out of trouble. Ethan's fraudulent activities finally caught up with him, and he was arrested for his involvement in a shady investment scheme. I handed over additional evidence to the authorities, ensuring there was no way for him to escape accountability. As the legal battles unfolded, my parents tried to reach out with an offer to reconcile. They wanted to meet privately to discuss moving forward as a family. I agreed to meet but made it clear that there would be no sweeping the past under the rug. During the meeting, I demanded that they take full accountability for their years of neglect and favoritism. Their response was full of excuses and half-hearted apologies, which only solidified my decision to keep my distance. While sorting through old family records, I came across documents that revealed something shocking. Ethan and Victoria had manipulated my grandfather for years, pressuring him into signing off on risky ventures and questionable expenses. The evidence further justified his decision to leave them out of the trust's control. I brought the documents to the lawyer, ensuring they were properly filed in case my siblings ever tried to challenge my authority again. With all this in mind, I made the decision to formally remove Ethan and Victoria from the trust. They were now completely cut off financially, left to fend for themselves. My parents, too, faced consequences. Without access to trust funds, they were forced to downsize their lifestyle significantly. Their once grand home was sold, and they moved to a much smaller house in a less affluent area. Surprisingly, some extended family members who had always sided with my parents began reaching out to me. They expressed regret for ignoring me in the past and applauded the changes I was making. It felt strange to have their support after so many years, but I accepted it cautiously. My focus remained on implementing long-term plans for the trust, ensuring the funds were used responsibly. In the end, I found a sense of peace. I had spent my life being overlooked and underestimated, but now I had control over my own narrative. The family might never recover from their fall, but that was no longer my concern. I was finally free to build a future on my own terms, and I planned to make the most of it. After I formally removed Ethan and Victoria from the trust, the backlash hit its peak. My siblings and parents decided to cut off all contact with me. Ethan sent a scathing message, accusing me of tearing the family apart, while Victoria took to social media, painting herself as a victim of betrayal. My parents, though quieter in their approach, made it clear through mutual acquaintances that I was no longer welcome in their lives. It didn't faze me. They had disowned me in every way that mattered long before this. Meanwhile, public opinion was overwhelmingly in my favor. The media story about the changes I made to the trust continued to gain traction, and people began reaching out with messages of support. Many praised me for standing up against entitlement and doing something good with the family's wealth. The scholarship program, in particular, struck a chord, and applications flooded in from students eager for a chance at higher education. Around this time, Victoria attempted a dramatic public apology. She posted a tearful video online, claiming she was ready to take accountability and repair our relationship. It felt hollow, especially when I noticed subtle jabs about how I'd changed after gaining power. I stayed silent, refusing to engage. The estate sale, as expected, didn't go smoothly. My family filed legal paperwork in an attempt to block it, arguing that selling the home would destroy their legacy. They underestimated how prepared I was. With the help of my lawyer friend, I expedited the process and made sure everything was airtight. Their efforts fell apart in court, and the sale went through. Watching the for sale sign go up was bittersweet, but I knew it was the right decision. The proceeds went straight into the trust, earmarked for community initiatives. Not long after, I hosted a charity gala to announce new programs funded by the trust. It was a spectacular event, attended by local leaders, educators, and even some distant relatives who wanted to make amends. I unveiled plans for a new community center, which would offer free classes, mentorship programs, and resources for underprivileged families. The press coverage was glowing, describing the night as a shining example of how wealth could be used responsibly. In contrast, my family's social reputation was in shambles. The pressure proved too much for my parents. They began publicly criticizing me, claiming I had disrespected the family legacy and manipulated my grandfather. Their accusations gained little traction, as most people saw through their bitterness. Behind closed doors, their marriage crumbled. My father moved out, and the whispers of divorce soon became official. Both blamed each other for the family's downfall, further isolating themselves from their shrinking social circle. Amidst the chaos, a former family friend reached out to me. She had distanced herself years ago due to my parents' behavior but wanted to share more stories about their manipulation. She confirmed what I already suspected. Ethan and Victoria had spent years exploiting my grandfather's trust, while my parents turned a blind eye. The additional context strengthened my resolve to stay the course. With no trust funds to fall back on, Ethan and Victoria had to find jobs. It didn't go well. Ethan's reputation as an unreliable entrepreneur made it hard for him to secure meaningful work, while Victoria struggled to adjust to life without luxury. A viral photo of her working as a retail cashier sparked a flurry of online comments, further denting her pride. Their struggles became part of a broader media narrative about the dangers of entitlement, turning the family into a cautionary tale. Surprisingly, old friends began to reconnect. Many had stayed away due to my family's toxic dynamics, but now they praised me for breaking free and doing something meaningful. Their support was a welcome change, a reminder that not everyone had written me off. My siblings weren't done causing trouble, though. They filed a lawsuit against me, alleging that I had coerced my grandfather into rewriting the will. The case went to court, but it didn't last long. The evidence of my grandfather's clear intentions and the legal safeguards we'd put in place were irrefutable. The judge dismissed the case, and my siblings left the courtroom humiliated. With the drama settling, I turned my attention to honoring my grandfather's memory. I established a foundation in his name, dedicated to funding educational programs and community development. The foundation quickly gained traction, earning praise from local leaders and cementing my reputation as someone who had turned a messy situation into a force for good. As for my parents, the stress of everything took its toll. Their divorce finalized quietly, with each blaming the other for the family's collapse. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they had moved to separate, modest homes. It was a stark contrast to the grand lifestyle they once flaunted. Ethan, in a rare moment of humility, reached out privately to ask for help. He wasn't looking for a handout, just advice. I agreed to help under strict conditions, making it clear this wasn't a reconciliation. I laid out a plan for him to rebuild his life, but whether he'd follow through remained to be seen. I moved into a modest home far from the family estate, focusing on my future. My work with the foundation gave me purpose, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. My family's chaos was behind me, and I was ready to build something meaningful on my own terms. The family estate officially sold for millions, closing the chapter on a place that had been a symbol of privilege and entitlement for so long. The proceeds went directly into the trust, funding new initiatives under the foundation. It was a satisfying moment, knowing the money was now being used to build something meaningful instead of financing lavish parties or doomed business ventures. The first project funded by the sale was a state-of-the-art community center offering free education and job training programs. Shortly after the estate sale, my parents quietly left town. Their social circle had dwindled to nothing, and the humiliation of losing their perfect family image had taken its toll. They moved to a small coastal town where they could live anonymously, far from the gossip and judgment of the community they once ruled. I heard through mutual connections that my father had taken up gardening, while my mother kept mostly to herself. Ethan, ever the dreamer, relocated overseas in hopes of a fresh start. He claimed he was pursuing business opportunities, but I suspected it was more about escaping the fallout. Victoria stayed local but struggled to adjust to a modest lifestyle. She was spotted working multiple retail jobs, her once carefully curated image a distant memory. Neither of them made any serious attempts to reconnect with me, and I didn't go out of my way to check on them. Meanwhile, the foundation flourished. What started as a single scholarship program grew into a multifaceted organization tackling issues like education, housing, and mental health support. The community center funded by the estate sale opened to rave reviews, and its programs were quickly oversubscribed. The foundation gained national attention, and I was invited to speak at conferences about philanthropy and responsible wealth management. Awards followed, and the recognition wasn't just for me, it was for the vision my grandfather had always wanted to see fulfilled. The shift in public opinion was striking. Extended family members who had once looked down on me now praised my efforts. They publicly distanced themselves from my parents and siblings, rewriting the narrative of our family's legacy. It wasn't lost on me that their sudden support was opportunistic, but I chose to let it slide. My focus was on the future, not revisiting old wounds. Years later, my parents made an attempt to reconcile. They sent a long letter expressing regret for how they had treated me and asking for a chance to rebuild our relationship. I responded politely but kept my distance. Their apology felt more like an attempt to ease their guilt than a genuine effort to repair the past. I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't interested in reopening that door. My siblings, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. Ethan's overseas ventures never took off, and he eventually settled into a quiet life, far removed from his former ambitions. Victoria kept a low profile, rarely seen in social circles. Their absence from the public eye was a stark contrast to the lives they once led, and it was clear they had no plans, or means, to reclaim their former status. In the absence of family, I built my own circle of close friends and allies. These were people who supported me unconditionally and celebrated my successes without any ulterior motives. Together, we created a strong network that felt more like family than my own ever had. It was a new chapter free of the toxicity and drama that had defined so much of my earlier life. My business, which had started as a college side hustle, also thrived. Without the weight of family expectations and distractions, I was able to focus entirely on its growth. It expanded into new markets and earned industry recognition, further proving that my independence wasn't just a fluke. It was a testament to hard work and resilience. One day, I found myself visiting my grandfather's grave. Standing there, I reflected on everything that had happened, the struggles, the betrayals, and ultimately, the transformation. My grandfather had once expressed regret for the family's dysfunction, and while I couldn't fix the past, I knew I had honored his vision for the future. The family wealth was now a force for good, helping countless people instead of fueling greed and entitlement. It felt like closure, a quiet victory shared between me and the man who had believed in me when no one else did. The impact of the foundation was undeniable. Local communities were thriving, with tangible improvements in education, employment, and quality of life. People who had never met my grandfather spoke of him with respect, his name now associated with generosity and positive change. It was a legacy I was proud to carry forward. Looking back, I felt no guilt about the decisions I had made. They had been necessary, not just for me but for the greater good. The family's downfall was a consequence of their own choices, and while I wish things could have been different, I didn't regret taking the path I did. Now I live a quiet, fulfilling life far removed from the chaos of my past. My days are spent working on the foundation, expanding its reach, and enjoying the peace that comes with knowing I've built something meaningful. It's not the life my family had envisioned for me, but it's the life I always wanted, and that's more than enough.